The Galactic Academy for Interspecies Diplomacy didn't smell like anything. Not really. The walls sanitized the air every second, stripping it of scent, pollen, bacteria, and anything remotely comforting. It was like breathing in a vacuum that hummed with passive-aggressive bureaucracy. Mason Ellis stood at the base of Atrium 6, clutching the handle of a battered Earth-made leash, one duffel slung over his shoulder. Bucket, his golden retriever, panted at his side, tail wagging with wild joy that made Mason's whole arm vibrate. "First human this cycle," a passing administrator chirped in a whirring translation drone. A gelatinous creature in a silver sash, probably from Milk Prime, oozed by, rotating a dozen eye stalks toward Mason. Another student floated past on a cushion of anti-grav vapor, their elongated limbs crossed in meditative repose, and immediately recoiled when Bucket barked once in sheer excitement. "That is your lunch?" the floater asked, voice trembling like thin metal. Mason sighed. "He's not lunch, he's my pet. My name's Mason. This is Bucket." "Like the fluid container?" "Yes, because when he was a puppy, he stuck his head into one, and wouldn't let go." A silence fell. Not reverent. Confused. Bucket sneezed. 2 hours later. By the time Mason reached his quarters, 14 different species had stared at Bucket. 3 had recoiled in fear, and at least 2 he was fairly sure had tried to start a betting pool about how long the primitive predator would last. Bucket, unfazed, pranced into the small dorm suite and immediately flopped belly first onto the cooling mat. He rolled over, exposing his stomach like a furry welcome mat. The door chimed. Mason opened it to see an angular, crystalline figure framed by the corridor lights. "I am Ulick," it said, photosynthetic panels shifting in subtle gradients of color. "We are neighbors. I am second-track diplomacy with subfocus on xenolinguistics. Is that your meat bag?" Mason blinked. "Excuse me?" "The quadruped. You collect its waste in polymer satchels. It is a biological hazard, yes?" "You're talking about poop bags?" "Affirmative. I viewed a recording." Mason ran a hand down his face. "He's a dog. He's domesticated, loyal, friendly, has saved lives back on Earth. You just don't understand." "I do not, but I will observe. I find this anomaly of yours fascinating, perhaps even hilarious." Ulick turned and floated off with the elegance of a sentient wind chime. Mason turned to Bucket, who was chewing on the Academy issue welcome packet. "What do you think, bud?" he said, gently pulling it from his jaws. "New school, new friends, please don't eat anyone." Bucket licked his face. Later that week. Interstellar species culture was taught by a retired Skelvan ambassador who now resembled a dried fungus in a hover chair. The moment Mason walked in with Bucket, conversations halted. "Companions must be non-sentient and unintrusive," the instructor droned, not even turning his stalks to face them. "Does it shed?" Mason nodded. "Yes, but I've got grooming protocols." "And defecate?" "Well, yeah. I clean up after him. It's no big deal." There was a collective inhale. A battalion student dropped her tablet. "You mean," whispered a plant-like creature across the row, "you collect its waste. With your hands." "1. With gloves and bags. It's hygienic. It's normal on Earth." A snort echoed from the back. Ulick raised a crystal arm. "Permission to submit supplemental footage?" The instructor nodded. A hologram bloomed mid-air. It showed a grainy security clip from 2 nights ago. Bucket, tail wagging, sniffed curiously at a glowing ceremonial orb in the east courtyard. Before Mason could stop him, Bucket had licked it, then tried to bury it, with his paws, in polished marble. Laughter erupted across the class. "Interplanetary artifact desecration. Oh, the Earthlings and their beasts," someone cackled. "Yeah, hilarious," Mason muttered, burning. 3 days later. Bucket was labeled a mobile sanitation concern in one of the Academy's informal group chats. Mason found out when a fellow human cadet, Abby Lynn from Mars Colony, showed him the meme. Bucket wearing a little vac suit, sitting on a fake toilet. "Ignore it," she said. "They mocked my knitting too. Said fabric binding with needles was an outdated survival ritual. But this is different. This is Bucket." And it was. Mason had nearly opted not to bring him. The Academy allowed 1 non-sentient companion, but it had been meant for things like motionless comfort orbs or ambient scent emitters. Not something with fur, teeth, and opinions. Mason watched his dog that night, curled up with his nose on his paw, eyes following him with quiet devotion, and felt the hot ache of loneliness twist in his chest. He rubbed his shoulder. It had been bothering him again. Old injury. Bucket lifted his head, concerned. "I'm fine," Mason whispered. "We've got the dome sim tomorrow. Don't worry." Bucket laid his head back down, but didn't sleep. Simulation dome disaster response drill. The dome shimmered with artificial terrain, simulating a tectonic uplift zone on a Class 3 planet, rocky cliffs, sharp wind, and a slight tremor underfoot. Students were assigned partners. Mason got Ulick. "Perimeter mapping is my task," the crystal said. "You will mark the ingress point." Mason nodded. "Fine." He had slipped Bucket in under a gray cloak, arguing to the dome clerk that he helped monitor Mason's cortisol levels. The clerk didn't argue, probably too tired to care. 10 minutes into the sim, things went wrong. A deep vibration rumbled beneath their feet. Then a crack opened under the artificial ridge. Mason turned to shout just as a fragment of sim rock, real enough to crush bone, crashed down. Pain lanced through his left leg, and he heard a sickening pop in his right shoulder as he fell. The world tilted. He didn't scream, but he groaned, hard, biting down to avoid blacking out. "Ellis!" Ulick shouted from above. "You are trapped. I will request retrieval. Do not bleed excessively." "Thanks," Mason croaked. "I'll try not to schedule a hemorrhage." Emergency systems should have kicked in instantly. But nothing happened. The dome just hummed, serene and unbothered. Then came barking. Bucket had wriggled free of his cloak, assessed the scene in half a second, and launched into what could only be described as mission chaos. He bolted for the barrier wall, scrambled up a broken ledge with terrifying determination, and then zap. Sparks flew from a faulty energy cable near the edge of the ridge. Bucket bit through it. "Contain that meat creature!" someone shrieked from the upper platform. "It's rabid." Ulick descended cautiously with a stun baton drawn. "Do not be alarmed. I will administer mild electrical correction. It is a non-lethal tool." Mason tried to shout, to warn him. "Don't you touch him!" Too late. Ulick poked forward. Bucket, eyes locked on Mason, spun in a blur. The stun baton never even connected. What followed was not an attack, it was a defensive explosion of fur and fury. Ulick screamed and flung himself onto a safety console, arms tucked in, vibrating in what could only be described as mortal terror. "Cease!" a voice called from above. Security bots deployed, but Bucket had already reached Mason and begun digging with frantic paws. His fur was singed, his gums bled, but he didn't stop. Mason reached a trembling hand out and murmured, "Good boy." The bots paused, and the emergency override finally kicked in. The sim dome's override hissed as the artificial terrain powered down, cliffs retracting and debris melting into the floor like ice under a heat lamp. Harsh white lights flickered to life, revealing the full absurdity of the scene. Mason half buried under a collapsed platform, face pale with pain, and Bucket muzzle dusty. Fur frizzed from electrical discharge, growling at anyone who dared take a step too close. A cleanup droid buzzed forward. Bucket barked once. The droid reversed. "Mason Ellis, remain still," the intercom ordered. "Emergency medical is en route. Do not allow the animal to interfere." "That's not," Mason wheezed, his legs screaming with every breath. "He's not interfering, he's helping." Ulick, still crouched on the safety console, raised a trembling crystalline arm. "It has intelligence parameters beyond non-sentience. I witnessed tactical behavior. It intercepted a Class 2 restraint field and launched a precision counterstrike. This violates the Academy's biological companion clause." "Ulick," Mason said, panting. "It licked your foot and barked at your stick. I am filing a panic trigger exception. Your pet attempted psychological warfare." Bucket, now gently pawing at the debris pinning Mason's leg, whined. Blood dotted the fur around his paws. He had been digging non-stop, and his claws were worn raw. Mason reached out with his good arm and placed a hand on Bucket's head. "I'm okay, boy. Just hold on. They're coming." And they were. The med team swept in 6-legged bots, 2 humanoid orderlies, and a human trauma tech who dropped to Mason's side with practiced calm. "You're gonna be fine. I'm technician Raina Dupree. Your vitals are spiking, but you're conscious, alert, and swearing, so I'm optimistic." "My leg," Mason said through clenched teeth. "It's bad." "We'll assess," she said. "We're getting a compression scan right now. Shoulder too?" He nodded. "Possible dislocation. We'll immobilize it until we get you to med bay. Stay still." Bucket growled when the second medic moved in. "He's protective," Mason warned. "Just let me talk to him." Raina paused. "You have control?" Mason looked Bucket in the eye. "Easy, buddy. I'm okay. Let them work. No more digging. No biting." "Got it?" Bucket whined but stepped back, tail low, ears flat. Ulick observed from the console, cradling the stun baton like a relic of war. "It obeys spoken commands, with comprehension." Raina muttered, "Yeah, welcome to Earth biology. The dog's more disciplined than half the cadets here." The scan completed with a quiet chirp. Raina squinted at the data. "Fractured tibia. Midshaft. Clean break. But we'll need to splint for transport. Shoulders dislocated but no signs of nerve damage. You'll need surgery for the leg. 4 weeks off at minimum. 6 to be safe." Mason closed his eyes. "Great." Bucket pressed his nose into Mason's arm. "He okay?" Mason asked. He chewed through a live cable. "We'll run a scan at the vet unit, but if he's moving like that, he's probably just singed. Tough pup." "Yeah," Mason said, eyes still closed. "He's always been tough." 2 days later, Academy Med Bay. Mason lay on his cot with his leg elevated, a rigid frame running down the outside of his calf, holding the tibia in place post-surgery. His shoulder was strapped down in a sling and padded brace. He'd had 2 hours of sleep since the operation. Bucket lay curled on a mat beside the cot, bandaged paws outstretched, tail thumping gently whenever Mason stirred. The door slid open, and a familiar click of crystal limbs echoed in. "I come in peace," Ulick said, raising his arms like a surrendering alien in a bad Earth movie. Mason opened one eye. "You nearly tased my dog." "I attempted behavioral correction." "You screamed and climbed a console." "I have since read 10 articles on Earth canines." Ulick paused. One included footage of a police dog named Gary subduing 6 armed suspects in under 2 minutes. "I now understand the term good boy carries significant tactical weight." Mason grunted. Ulick stepped closer, hesitantly. "The administration has issued a statement." "About Bucket?" "Yes. Following the dome incident, the footage was reviewed by Ethics, Security, and Intercultural Policy. Consensus: Bucket's actions were classified as protective loyalty behavior, not aggression." Mason looked down at his furry guardian. "What happens now?" Ulick extended something with a crystalline finger, a small badge, etched in silver and shaped like a paw print. Designation: Support Asset. Tier 2. He is now recognized as a registered non-sentient aid, permitted in all public spaces, including training environments. Mason took the badge, stunned. Bucket sneezed. "They gave my dog a badge." "Technically a collar patch," Ulick clarified. "But yes, he outranks the cleaning droids." Mason laughed, wincing. "Thanks." Ulick looked around awkwardly. Some students still fear him, but others admire him. One tried to befriend him by offering protein bars. He stole their gloves and buried them in the hydroponic gardens. "That tracks." Ulick turned to leave, then stopped. "I too sought companionship. I acquired an Earth goldfish from the exchange unit." Mason sat up slightly. "And?" "It expired, in 23 hours. Mason blinked. "Did you feed it?" "I sang to it. Light-based harmonic tones, very soothing." "That'll do it." 1 week later. Mason had started physical therapy, 2 sessions per day. His shoulder had been reduced under sedation and was healing, but his leg still ached deep in the bone every time he moved it. Bucket attended every session, lying beside the equipment like a fluffy sentinel. The physical therapist noted a consistent drop in Mason's heart rate whenever the dog was present. "I'd prescribe him if I could," she joked. "Best cardio regulator I've seen." The The sim dome was closed for recalibration, but the Academy net had already done what it always did, replay the drama from 20 different camera angles. Bucket's footage had gone viral. A popular remix video overlaid dramatic music while he clawed through debris. The top-rated comment read, "If this is what their pets do, don't touch the humans." Raina had visited again, bringing a small upgrade, a collar patch for Bucket. It gleamed silver, inscribed with Service Companion, Loyalty Protocol. "It's just cosmetic," she said, scratching his ears. "But it'll make the bureaucrats feel better." Mason nodded. "He deserves it." That night, as Bucket dozed on the floor and the lights dimmed, Mason looked out at the artificial stars through the transparent wall. He still felt like an anomaly here, soft-edged, too emotional, carrying a piece of Earth like a shedding, slobbery shadow. But maybe that was the point. Aliens understood data, protocols, precision. What they didn't understand until now was the quiet, stubborn power of loyalty. The kind that bled, barked, bit through cables, and sat vigil beside a hospital bed with sore paws and tired eyes. Mason reached down, brushing his fingers over Bucket's head. "Thanks for saving my life, buddy." Bucket thumped his tail once, then drifted back to sleep. 3 weeks post-injury, Mason's leg itched constantly beneath the rigid brace. His shoulder had recovered enough to allow partial movement, though he still slept propped up with a nest of pillows and an auto-tilt wedge to prevent rolling. Physical therapy had shifted from tentative to grueling. Nothing glamorous. Sweat, pain, and the frustration of muscles that had forgotten what stairs were. Bucket was a constant. The Academy had restructured their policies after the incident. Support companions like Bucket now had a designated access level, which meant Mason no longer had to sneak him into buildings like a furry contraband tube. They even assigned a liaison officer to manage the integration of terrestrial species in interspecies educational domains. That officer, unfortunately, was Ulick. "I have updated the pamphlet," Ulick announced one afternoon, stepping into the PT room with 2 copies clutched delicately in his crystalline grip. "It is titled Earth Mammals, From Sanitary Risk to Survival Partner. There is a section on oral fixation rituals and tennis balls." Mason didn't look up from the resistance band he was pulling. "You wrote a pamphlet?" "I co-authored it with a Solarian behaviorist. We disagreed about drool viscosity relevance." Bucket trotted up, sniffed Ulick's ankle, and gently placed a tennis ball at his feet. Ulick flinched. "Why does it want this?" "He wants you to throw it." "For what purpose?" "To retrieve it." "Why would I perform labor so it can perform labor?" "Welcome to fetch." Bucket stared up at Ulick, tail wagging in hypnotic rhythm. Ulick hesitated, then nudged the ball gently down the hallway. Bucket exploded into motion, skidding around a corner with a sound like thunder in a fur coat. Ulick stumbled back. "That was so fast. Was that a threat response?" Mason groaned as he switched legs. "That was joy." Joy appears concerning. A few days later, outdoor rec zone. The rec zone was a small dome within the larger facility, set aside for species requiring atmosphere, space, or specialized movement. Gravity adjustable, weather programmable. Mason had fought to gain access again. Part of his rehab plan included outdoor walking, and Bucket, too, needed time to stretch his legs. Today, the gravity was set to Earth normal. The air carried a faint, artificial breeze. Bucket raced ahead through simulated grass that swayed just like the meadows back home. Mason walked with a light exobrace around his recovering leg, every step careful. He still limped, still cursed the dull throb in his calf after long stretches. But it was improving. Other students wandered the dome. Some now watched Bucket with wary respect. A few even greeted him cautiously. One of them, a Zelari cadet named Throne, approached. His long arms hung like ropes, and his eyes blinked in slow vertical rhythms. "I studied your companion," he said in a gravelly voice. The footage was compelling. The part where he shielded your unconscious form with his body was difficult to interpret. I assumed it was fear-based freezing. Mason shook his head. "No, that was guarding." Throne tilted his head. "He endangered himself for no strategic gain." "He doesn't think like that. He just protects." "That is not logical." Mason shrugged. "Neither is friendship. But here we are. Throne nodded slowly. I am attempting to understand. I began training with a therapy bird from Luna 3. It defecated on my textbook and flew into a ceiling fan. Progress, Mason said with a smile. Bucket barreled back across the dome, flinging mud from simulated puddles. He leapt toward Mason, then stopped just short, sensing the fragile leg, and sat down carefully. Throne blinked again. He calibrated. Yeah, he knows where I hurt. Does it have medical sensors? Mason reached down to scratch Bucket's head. Nope, just love. Later that week, Lecture Hall 9. A guest speaker had arrived, Ambassador Drevian, a four-limbed intellectual from Othar Prime, known for writing Diplomacy Under Fire, Negotiation in Hostile Terrain. He had survived 8 hostage crises and once talked down a sentient lava pool. Mason, crutch under one arm, took a back seat with Bucket curled at his feet. Drevian swept into the hall. Today's topic: trust structures. Who do you trust when protocols fail? He gestured, and the holoscreen displayed a moment from the simulation dome, Bucket snarling as he dug toward Mason. The room went quiet. Let us discuss this, Drevian said. Why did the creature act when others did not? A few murmurs. Ulick raised his hand. Emotional tethering. Earth species exhibit neurochemical loyalty bonds, sometimes overriding logic. Indeed, Drevian agreed. Yet the question remains, would we be better negotiators if we adopted such irrational loyalty? An uneasy silence followed. Trust isn't just a logic gate, Mason said, speaking up from the back. It's built over time. Bucket's not just bonded to me by biology. We trained, lived, went through things together. He knows my moods, I know his tells. That bond, that irrational loyalty, isn't a flaw, it's how humans survive. A few students nodded, others looked unconvinced. Then Drevian asked, and what if he had failed? What if he'd gotten in the way? Mason didn't flinch. Then at least I'd know I wasn't alone. That evening, dormitory complex. Mason sat with his leg iced and elevated, watching a stream of Academy Net videos. Bucket snored beside him. One of the top trending vids was a remix, Ulick shrieking while climbing the console, paired with classic Earth comedy sound effects. Mason chuckled. I should delete that. He didn't. A message blinked on his tablet. Incoming memo. Policy update, non-sentient companion safety protocol. It was long, legalistic, and dry, except for one line. Under exceptional conditions, terrestrial canines may be classified as conditional aid assets. Evaluations to be conducted post-incident with supporting footage. Emphasis on emotional stabilization and direct threat response. Mason leaned back. They weren't just tolerating Bucket now. They were learning. 2 months after the Sim Dome incident, Mason Ellis jogged, limped, really down the Academy's west corridor. The exobrace was gone now, his leg bearing full weight, but the stiffness lingered like an old argument. His shoulder twinged if he slept wrong. He'd regained full mobility, but the occasional creak of tendons reminded him just how much the body remembered. He paused at the edge of the lecture amphitheater, squinting inside. Bucket trotted ahead and immediately became the center of attention. Oh no, Mason muttered, don't you dare. But Bucket, determined ambassador of Earth canine nonsense, plopped down next to a pale green Vexari student who was clearly not used to anything furry. The Vexari froze as Bucket licked its elbow twice, then sighed and laid his head in the alien's lap. Why me? The student whispered. Mason gave a quick 2-fingered whistle. Bucket returned instantly, tongue out, tail wagging. The entire class was watching. Sorry, Mason said with a sheepish shrug. He's still getting used to interspecies etiquette. Clearly, came a dry voice from the front. Instructor Mivel, the Academy's cross-cultural negotiation lead, and one of the few faculty members who had never once smiled, not even during the surprise carnival day, motioned Mason forward. You've recovered, she said, scanning his updated profile, and you've requalified for advanced sim training. Working on it, cleared for re-entry next week. Mivel glanced down at Bucket. And the dog? He's better than I am. Didn't break a leg. Unfortunate, she muttered. We've had 3 petitioners request canine companions after your dome stunt. The logistics department is now revising the ventilation filter thresholds. And I had to explain what a chew toy was to the Board of Sentient Materials. Progress? Chaos, she corrected, then more softly, but illuminating. Mason settled into his usual seat. Bucket lay at his feet, chin on paws, eyes alert. Miville cleared her throat. Today we explore adaptive diplomacy. When plans collapse, when cultures clash, what survives? What bridges the unknown? A pause. Mason looked down at the quiet warmth pressed against his foot. Sometimes the bridge didn't talk, it barked. 3 days later, Academy Plaza. It was the first official outdoor Earth Culture Exhibition Day, and someone, probably a bored logistics intern, had decided it should feature a demonstration of Earth pet behavior. Ulick had insisted on moderating. He stood before an audience of several dozen species, holding a remote pointer with the deadly seriousness of a field surgeon. Observe the Earth canine. Designation: bucket. Note: fur density, tail oscillation, and default facial expression, interpreted by humans as happy, but more accurately, a mild panting loop due to body temperature regulation. Bucket sat on a raised platform, wearing his badge collar. He blinked at the crowd and yawned. Mason stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching with an expression somewhere between proud dad and exhausted tour guide. Ulick continued. We now demonstrate the fetch response. I have consulted 3 Earth trainers and a rubber object known as the squeaky bone. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Ulick held up the toy. Ready your documentation devices. He tossed it gently. Bucket blinked, stared at the bone, then turned and walked in the opposite direction. Laughter erupted from the human contingent. Mason called, You didn't use the voice. What voice? Ulick asked, baffled. Mason walked over, picked up the bone, locked eyes with Bucket, and said in a bright, ridiculous tone, Woo wants it. Huh? Go get it, buddy. Then he chucked it. Bucket launched forward like a missile made of fur and joy. Gasps from the audience. Bucket returned seconds later, dropped the toy at Mason's feet, then flopped down, tail sweeping the ground. Ulick looked stunned. It obeyed. But only for you? That's the point, Mason said. It's not just commands, it's connection. A Solarian stepped forward. But what does it do? It chases things, it sheds, it consumes socks. Sure, Mason said, but when a quake drops half a mountain on your chest, it digs you out. When you can't move, it stays. When you're at your worst, it's not calculating exit strategies. The silence that followed was thoughtful. Then someone tossed a ball. Bucket chased it with such speed that half the crowd dove behind the decorative hedges. 1 week later, graduation assembly. Mason sat with a brace on his wrist, overdid it in the gym that week, and Bucket, now officially recognized as the Academy's first non-sentient companion distinguished service asset, lay calmly at his feet. The dean, a multi-eyed Carithian known for his florid speeches and fondness for sparkle robes, cleared his throats, all 5 of them. Before we conclude, one last honor. For demonstrating extraordinary loyalty, initiative, and interspecies adaptability, not to mention an impeccable sense of timing, we recognize a member of our student body whose actions inspired a new class of diplomacy. Mason tensed, already shaking his head. This individual is not a cadet in the traditional sense, but his presence redefined what it means to protect and to connect. A low murmur spread through the assembly. Would Cadet Mason Ellis please bring Bucket to the stage? Mason groaned. You're loving this, aren't you? Bucket wagged his tail and barked once. Together, they limped onto the stage, Mason still favoring his leg, Bucket walking slow beside him. The dean affixed a small gold pin to Bucket's collar, henceforth recognized as Companion Class Ambassadorial Aid. Welcome to the archives of diplomatic history, Bucket of Earth. Bucket barked once. Ulick fainted. Later that night, dormitory roof. The stars above the Galactic Academy burned pale and endless. Mason sat cross-legged, ankle-wrapped, eating from a bag of unreplicated Earth popcorn. Bucket lay beside him, watching the sky as if he understood it. You know, Mason said, tossing a kernel, I thought bringing you here was a mistake. Bucket didn't respond, of course, but his tail thumped gently. They laughed, mocked, called you a biohazard. Bucket yawned. And now you've got a badge, 3 different species trying to clone your behavior, and your own fan club. The dog licked Mason's hand and laid his head on his lap. Mason smiled, quietly. Because for all the technology, the training, the theories about diplomacy and cross-species understanding, the most powerful truth had proven to be this: